If you were a military planner before you went into Russia invaded Ukraine, your biggest strategic threat to that operation would be that NATO would get involved, because you'd know that if NATO were involved, you would fail. So therefore, you would do everything possible to mitigate that risk. And therefore, the tirade of threats, the rhetoric that you would come out with, that's why Vladimir Putin has regularly threatened the nuclear saber, because he knows that Western politicians are not veterans of the Cold War era. It's new narrative to them and it scares them. After the drone attacks into Poland, the drone attacks into Romania, after the 3 MiG-31s going into Estonia, all of a sudden, NATO's suddenly woken up and gone, hang on a minute, this is a real threat. And I think that could, in my humble opinion, should provoke a very different response to NATO.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1,319 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking again to Sean Bell. Sean, former RAF fighter pilot, or a Harrier pilot. That puts you above normal fighter pilots in my view, but we've talked about that before. And a former Air Vice Marshal in the RAF, and now military analyst, co-founder of Red Matrix Productions and the High Ground podcasts. You're also an ambassador for the RAF Association, and you're doing a lot of charity work into Ukraine as well. Sean, welcome back to Frontline.
Philip, a great pleasure to join you from here on the ground in Lviv this morning.
Yeah, well, you're in Lviv. That's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. First of all, why are you there? And can you give us a flavour for what the Ukrainian people are feeling and seeing? Because you know perfectly well, all we see in the news pictures are the attacks going into Kyiv, the attacks going into Lviv, civilians being targeted by Vladimir Putin. That must be having a psychological impact. Is that what you're seeing and feeling?
Well, you're absolutely right, Philip. I mean, you and I have been involved helping try to make some sense out of the military analyst part of the whole conflict. And very early on in this, one of my Ukrainian interpreters said to me, why don't you go out? And I sort of, actually, good idea. Short version of a much longer story meant that late last year I ended up going out to Kyiv via Lviv. Torturous to get out there because you can't fly. It's, coaches and trains. But I have to say, my first impressions of Kyiv, it's such a beautiful city. You walk around there, you buy yourself a Costa coffee, and have a wander around on the cobbled street.
Other coffee brands must be available
be available, but it just that sense of normality, though, that it was just... and this time round, we arrived earlier on this week, and I wouldn't want to downplay it, but we went around for about an hour and never saw one building that was damaged. There are clearly devastating attacks happening in Kyiv, but my mother was worried about me coming out, and she thought it would be like sort of London in the Blitz. In reality, it's not like that. The front line is horrendous. I'm too old, too past it to be ending up going anywhere close to that. But people are going around their normal business. The streets are full, the shops are full, there's no shortage of goods. I think the couple of things you do notice are that there are not that many fighting age men walking around the streets. A lot of women who are looking a bit, it's sad. There's a sort of air of resignation around the place. And I go to Maidan Square. I won't borrow the history of it, but it's an important place in the middle of Kyiv. And they've got a sort of an area set aside where you put a flag, and a little Ukrainian flag, and mark the name of the fallen. And it's a really good way of illustrating the scale of the problem. I probably, like you, I sort of find it very sombering to go to the French military cemeteries to see the lines of crosses, and it just brings that sense of scale and poignancy. You go to Maidan Square and these flags, there's not tens, there's not hundreds, there's not thousands. There are tens of thousands of these flags, some small, some big, some pictures. And I always spend sort of half an hour there just reflecting, because it just makes it's a really stark reminder of the dreadful cost of this war.
Yeah, it's the reality and the human cost that is very difficult to portray whenever you're commentating on it. But of an evening, and there's a fantastic app which I'm sure you have that sends you the alarms every time there's a potential air raid. How does that affect people from a psychological perspective? How does it affect you? Once your app says get to the shelters, what's the adrenaline rush like? What's the feeling? Or people on the ground just accepted it as a way of normal life, and do some ignore it?
One of the things that's fascinating about ex-military, you and I have spent quite a lot of time on operations in our time, and we're somewhat philosophical about warnings because it's not really if the bullet's running around with your name on it, it's going to get you. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be safe and secure, but it doesn't put the fear of God in when these air raid warnings go off. And I remember even this time round, an air raid warning went off when we were heading off to a meeting, and we looked around us to see if it changed the behaviour of anybody around us. And it didn't. The A-red warning has gone off when we've been in the hotel. There is an area where you should go, down in the basement. But when I was chatting to one of the locals, they said, yeah, you can go to the basement, but there was a building that was struck over there. And when it was struck, it collapsed down in on itself and literally just pancaked everybody in the basement. So there is this philosophical view that people are just getting on with their lives now. And the only time it's somewhat sombering, I remember my first visit to Kyiv late last year. And it was by a coach. I was dropped off about 5 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the city outside this sort of rather barren coach area. And I was there with my 3 big bags on the street corner. It was dark. It was slightly raining. The air raid warnings were going off. There was no taxis or anything anywhere near. And I'm looking around going, this isn't the smartest place to be, is it? But actually, pretty quickly, you join the rest of the nation. And I think your point is that it was at the weekend when they had their last major strike, talking to people then, it was just difficult to sleep. That's what and if you've got families, you'd imagine, you are much more worried about your family than you are yourself. And I think it's etched into the faces of people on the ground here. They're very philosophical. They're getting around life. But there's a lot of reminders that there's a major war of national survival going on around them.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I grew up in Northern Ireland through the Troubles, and the terrorist threat that there was. And I lived in one of the most bombed towns in Europe on the front line near the border. And it becomes a way of life. It becomes a normality, and you watch the news to see what's happening. And people who haven't lived through that don't quite get it. You do, because you've been in conflict situations and everything else.
But it's a good point, actually, Philip. If I may, I think that's a really good example, because when we had the Troubles and occasionally there were explosions in London as a result of the RA or whatever. And I remember talking to American colleagues at the time saying, how can you live in London with all this death and destruction? You do realise London's quite a big place. And this was one building, tragic though it was, and one of the reasons I think you have to be a bit philosophical is that even in that massive wave of attacks at the weekend, there were less than 10 people died at that time. On the roads of our country, every day, 8 people die on the roads of this country. It doesn't stop people getting their cars and driving around. Psychologically, yes, it's damaging. But actually, if you look at the actual price on the ground for the civilians, yes, it's a shock. But actually, there are other activities that are pretty dangerous as well. It doesn't stop us doing those.
Yeah, well, talking of other activities that are particularly dangerous, it's Vladimir Putin talking. And yesterday, he said that Russia will respond quickly should Europe provoke Moscow amid what he called militarization of the continent driven by hysteria. He was addressing the Valdy Discussion Club, which is a forum of Russian experts at the Black Sea resort of Sochi. And Putin said that Russia had shown through the centuries that it would retaliate if provoked. I think his exact quote was, if anyone still has a desire to compete with us in the military sphere, as we say, feel free, let them try. Should we be worried?
Philip, you and I probably would have a fantastic glass of wine talking about this. If you were a military planner before you went into Russia invaded Ukraine, your biggest strategic threat to that operation would be that NATO would get involved, because you'd know that if NATO were involved, you would fail. So therefore, you would do everything possible to mitigate that risk. And therefore, the tirade of threats, the rhetoric that you would come out with, that's why Vladimir Putin has regularly threatened the nuclear saber, because he knows that Western politicians are not veterans of the Cold War era. It's new narrative to them, and it scares them. After the drone attacks into Poland, the drone attacks into Romania, after the 3 MiG-31s going into Estonia, all of a sudden, NATO's suddenly woken up and gone, hang on a minute, this is a real threat. And I think that could, in my humble opinion, should provoke a very different response to NATO. And I think what we're seeing is Putin just once again reminding politicians, get involved with me, you've got a fight on your hands.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the drone attacks, but we've been having a lot of drone incursions as well over European and NATO countries, and this it seems to be coming from the Russian Shadow Fleet. They seem to be large civilian type drones that are being flown over critical infrastructure, over military bases, over airfields, and disrupting normal air traffic that's going on. This seems to be Vladimir Putin, continuously poking the West. But over recent days and weeks, the volume of this seems to have increased dramatically. What do you think Putin's trying to achieve?
I think this is fascinating, Philip, and I wouldn't be at all surprised with your sort of intelligence hat on that you'd be looking at some of the other narratives around this. I think the danger is once Russia's painted as the enemy, that everything that happens we blame on Russia. And it might well be, but I understand that some of the drone incursions have now been proven to be sort of German-based for the drones. I also understand that there may be other nations or other smaller terrorist groups that want to conduct their activities to disrupt our way of life, knowing full well that the finger of blame will point towards Russia. I think for me, the question is, why would Russia try to provoke the NATO bear at a time when it is struggling in Ukraine? You can't think militarily that they would want to provoke a fight. The nearest I can get to any form of logic there is that, in my humble opinion, that the only way for NATO to protect its airspace now, because Russia clearly is doing incursions, is to be more robust with its response. Anything that comes into NATO airspace is shot down, but also potentially now put a no-fly zone. Because if Russia can't be trusted not to put drones into NATO, then NATO has to protect its border by putting a buffer zone in. And that means a no-fly zone. And I think that justification, NATO's been wavering about whether to do this or not for some time. It feels to me we've got the greatest justification we've ever had. And therefore, why would Putin therefore seek to try to avoid that? Because once we do start it, we can gradually spread it across Ukraine. And I think that would be a major problem for Putin to wrestle with.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I think it was yesterday or possibly the day before, French commandos raided one of the ships that were blamed for this. We haven't seen any reports of what they actually found on it, whether they found it had been a drone mothership, as well as other things. But again, from an intelligence perspective, I think the ones that have come from Putin are trying to do two things. One, probe what a political response would be, and basically highlight how difficult it is to get a political consensus against Russia and how weak NATO's Article 4 is, because Article 4 is really just a collective waggling of the finger and a stiff letter, and there's nothing else there. And the second thing is to test not just the military response, because a lot of this happens over civilian infrastructure. So there's not an automatic military response to a drone incursion. It's a civilian security organization's response, and just to test that, and again highlight how weak it is. But then, as we learn the lessons from it, our defenses are being strengthened, and we're hearing talk of a drone defensive wall that the Ukrainians are going out and helping to train NATO countries in putting together anti-drone drones. Would you have thought 3 years ago that the Ukrainians would be coming out and starting to teach NATO nations about how to defend themselves?
It is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot in that. I do think if you're going to be robust against Russia, I think what Putin has exposed is the political frailties of robust responses, because we get punched and therefore wonder, it's not really nice to punch the guy back again. Perhaps we should give him a bit more time, give him a bit of counselling. And you sort of go, no. Back in 2015, Turkey, 2 Russian aircraft came towards its airspace. One turned away. As soon as it came to the airspace, a Turkish F-16 shot it down. Putin went apoplectic. There was diplomatic furore. But sure enough, the dust eventually settled. And never, ever since that time have Russians gone inside Turkish airspace. They know what's going to happen. We seem to be questioning ourselves every step of the way about what we should and shouldn't do. And I think that just exposes our frailties. I know quite a few people that are serving at the moment, and even they were saying, we've got to be careful before we shoot something down in our airspace. And you're going, let's be clear, Russia is at war with Ukraine. Russia is deliberately provoking. Those MiG-31s, it wasn't accidental that they were in the airspace. As a former fighter pilot, they turned off the bit of equipment that identifies where they are. They were not talking on the radio. Modern fighter jets know exactly where they are.
So all the banter you used to get from us in the army was turning around complaining that you didn't know where you were and you're always heading something else. You're always late. What you're saying to me is you always knew where you were and you were always on time. So this was deliberate.
Well, yeah, that was the sort of 19 earlies, wasn't it? When both of us were rather younger,
and it was usually the helicopter force, and you had to hike out another 10 kilometers to try and find the pilots.
Well, yeah, and actually there was a lot of banter at the time, wasn't there? Because why would you join the army and get called?
Most of it was banter, and it was there deliberately to wind each other up. But you mentioned a no-fly zone, and we've clearly got a new air defense threat that's coming into the West. How complex is it dealing with drones in particular, given our air defense stance, and how easy or complex would it be to bring in a no-fly zone over parts of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the drone thing is very interesting. As you know, when you and I were serving, part of our capability was you didn't showcase everything you could do to the Soviet Union because you knew they would develop a counter. So you had a lot of capabilities in your skunk works where you would have it ready to go should you ever need it. The problem about us doing a drone war, as has been proposed, is you suddenly put up all of your showcase all your capability and simply give Russia a chance to work out how it's going to get round it. And I'm not for that at all. I do think there's been some amazing revolutions. You and I used to work in the days when it was you develop an electronic warfare capability, the Russian would have a countermeasure, then you'd have a countermeasure. We're seeing that in the drone area today, and Ukrainians bluntly, from being just drones getting jammed, so they then do terrain mapping radar, then they get jammed, then they now fiber optic, can't be jammed. I think there's a pace of technology which we're struggling to keep up with. But I do think we're learning lessons. I think we have to be quite careful, though, is that this doesn't mean drone warfare is going to be the only way of fighting in the future. For our day and for World War II, World War I, the artillery was the biggest cause of casualties. Now it's drones on the front line. And therefore, if you have a large land border and you're expecting to do a land warfare, you've absolutely got to consider how you do the counter. For us as an island nation, I think it's going to look very different, a bit like Israel and their attacks on Iran. It wasn't much drone there. It was back to conventional rollback air defenses, then use air superiority. And I think, therefore, yes, it's for a David versus Goliath battle, which you have with Ukraine. I think that Ukraine has been outstanding at developing a way of fighting back. Whether or not that endures in the long term is another matter.
Yeah, and how complex is it from a planning perspective to get a no-fly zone over even part of Ukraine, and what are the dangers associated with it?
Yeah, the problem with no-fly zone is, let's go right the way to the top, is that Russia really doesn't have any answer to Western air power. So we genuinely thought even the Russian aircraft they had were quite good. What's been very clear in the war against Ukraine is they've been singly unable to use that technology. So it's not just about aircraft. It's a people, spares, training, doctrine. It's the whole package of capability. And that's one thing it's exposed that Russia's pretty rubbish at. So the West has an asymmetric advantage. So that would appear to be a low-risk way of just turning the dial in Ukraine's favor. Extend a no-fly zone over part of Ukraine. Russia would probably take pot shots at times. Therefore, the rules of engagement are probably the most difficult thing to work out. If they shoot at you, would you shoot back? If a Russian air defense system that was based on Russian soil was to fire a missile, can you fire something back? Because you'd be killing Russian soldiers on Russian soil. That might be seen as a bit of an escalation. But the point is that, yes, there's lots of complexities, but from a NATO air power perspective, it'd be relatively simple to do. And what it would do is it would cause a major bit of grit inside Putin's thinking. Because at the moment, chatting to people on the ground, these glide bombs, the Russian Air Force is still having a devastating impact. As soon as you now put Western air power with missiles that can fire 100 miles, they don't know they're coming. And all of a sudden, it won't take many Russian fighters to fall out of the sky before suddenly they've got to rethink their tactics.
Yeah, and how important do you think it is that NATO steps up and European nations step up and show an aggressive line to Vladimir Putin and say quite clearly, stop messing with us?
I think this is one of the areas where, if it wasn't an interview, you interview me, and we actually had a bottle of wine on the table, we'd have a very lively debate about this. I have no doubt.
We'll do that, and we'll film it one day.
My own view is that so far, was it 3.5 years in, well over 1,000 days in, NATO has probably done enough to stop Ukraine losing, but not enough to help it win, or at least persuade Putin to stop. And if we don't do something else in the West, let's be really clear, Russia is advancing on the front line. Yes, its economy is taking a hit. Yes, the oil and gas industry is being targeted. But unfortunately, Ukraine is still losing people, and those people are relatively short supply. And it feels like there's a profound moment approaching for NATO and for the West. Do we continue to do what we're doing, but there's an inevitability that therefore that plays into Putin's hands? Or do we change the game and actually use our might, use our capability, not to start a war with Russia, but to confront Russia and stop it going any further? Because if Ukraine was to fall, that has profound implications for the safety and security of Europe, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. What are we going to do about those? Poland's spending a lot of money to defend itself. Less worried about that. But all of a sudden, I think you face an emboldened Putin if Ukraine falls. What's China going to think about that? What's North Korea going to think about that? What about Iran? I do think history will look back at this time. And you and I are both sort of war fighters, and the easy criticism is, oh, that's what they want to fight a war. And you go, neither of us, we've both seen the impact. Neither of us want that. But you stop a war by deterring your enemy, that the risk far outweighs the benefits. At the moment, we are not credible as NATO. We're not standing up. We're in the ring. We've got both our hands behind our back, and Putin's coming up to us every now and again and smacking us one. Yeah. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, there's a difference between those that want to protest for peace and those that will fight for peace. We may both be pacifists. One will help achieve peace, the other won't, and will have lots of flags to fly around the place. And I would argue that every service person and veteran who has ever been anywhere near a conflict is a pacifist at heart, but they will fight for peace because that's the only way to achieve it, given the aggressive nature of the human being as an animal. And that's just an unfortunate reality. But you talked about Ukraine losing there. We've seen a sea change in what Donald Trump said over the last week or so, backed by his now Secretary of State for War instead of Secretary of State for Defense, Pete Hegseth, as the Pentagon has been changed. And Donald Trump has said that Ukraine can win and take all of its territory back. What do you make of this political change that seems to have come in out of the blue?
Well, first of all, I'm somewhat cynical that we've actually seen a change at all. If we were to track daily the words that come out of the US president's mouth, I think we'd be jumping all over the place. I've also think whenever President Trump makes these sorts of announcements, it's interesting to see where he makes the announcements. These always seem to occur on Truth Social. And it's no coincidence that he is a major shareholder in Truth Social, which last time I saw, is worth billions of pounds. Therefore, putting controversial statements out attracts a load more traffic to his company, which makes him a lot of money. Is the rhetoric of one man going to change the pace of the war? No. If he was genuinely now aligning himself heavily behind Ukraine, I think we would see pretty quickly weapons like Tomahawk missiles, and lots of other weapons suddenly become available. Actions speak a lot louder than words when it comes to the US president. I don't think we should take anything from that rhetoric. We've seen that president, with the Alaska summit, I felt really uncomfortable. I'm sure you did, as Trump was clapping Putin as he made his way on a red carpet. President Trump clearly thought he was going to be able to change the game. But I think most of us just, thought this was playing to Putin's hands. Over a month later, nothing's changed. If in fact, probably the ferocity has increased. So I do think President Trump risks appearing somewhat impotent, and that's not something he would like to feel.
Yeah, well, and again, he always likes to back the winner. So maybe he suddenly realized that Putin will not be a winner, but we'll see. But you mentioned Tomahawk cruise missiles, and that's very interesting because there's a lot of debate around whether the US are going to supply Tomahawks to Ukraine. And General Keith Kellogg was asked about that on US television 2 nights ago, and he turned around and smiled, as General Kellogg always does, and said, "Well, that's a decision that the president will make." But again, the commentary seems to be fueling the debate. Tomahawks are interesting because the Ukrainians have launched their Flamingo cruise missile, which has got a range of 3,000 kilometers. The Tomahawk doesn't have 3,000 kilometers. It's got a warhead of 1.1 tons of high explosives. Well, the Tomahawk cruise missile has got a much smaller warhead. And therefore, what would they add to the game that the Ukrainians haven't got already? And would it be significant?
Yeah, it's a great question, Philip. If you look at it objectively, you go, if you're doing top trumps, you'd sort of go, surely the Flamingo is probably going to be,
this is a top trump.
Well,
in reality.
Yeah, but actually, when you look at it, it looks like something from the 1950s. And as you're well aware, the missiles today, yes, it's got to have a big warhead. Yes, it's got to be able to go a long way. But far more importantly, it's got to be very accurate, because if it's not accurate, all you're doing is making a lot of noise and a big bang somewhere close to your target. It's also got to be survivable. So an element of stealth capability and the ability to fly a preordained route down valleys, exploiting radar coverage, etc., is all down to that survivability. My understanding is that whilst the Flamingo is a very capable missile, they focused on brawn rather than brains. And therefore, if you're looking at how effective a missile is, almost certainly the Tomahawk will be much more effective. I'll use an analogy for the viewers here, because back in the Second World War, we used to have 1,000 bomber raids with the Lancasters. And the average miss distance of those bombs at the time, if you were aiming at your target, the average, you got 4 miles away. So the only way to hit a target was to carry 1,000 bombers, each carrying 20,000-pound bombs, 20,000 bombs, and even then you couldn't guarantee to hit your target. So mass has some benefits, but you just wreak carnage. Today, a single fighter jet with 3 bombs, each of those will go within 2 to 3 feet. You don't need to have such a big charge, because actually if you fly the bomb through a window and take out your target, why would you need a massive charge behind it? So don't get me wrong, I'm not belittling. I think the weapons that Ukraine are building, they have to build because they don't have to ask anybody's permission how to use them. But let's not kid ourselves. This is probably not state-of-the-art technology, but it's a really good example of how Ukraine, both in long-range drones and now with missiles, are taking the fight in a way to Russia. The oil and gas industry in Russia is suffering. How much? Who knows? But it is suffering. And that seems to be a way that Ukraine can fight back.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I agree completely. I remember in the 1990s and early noughties, targeting Tomahawks into places, and almost being asked which window would you like it to fly through, and what's the effect you want when it gets in there, so you can dial that effect in and out. But the challenges that brought. From an intelligence perspective, because you needed to know which window the bad guys were behind in a particular building, and that level of fidelity increases your challenges enormously.
But I think that point, Philip, I think though is why your form of the intelligence role is so vital. Sometimes we overlook it, but actually you're absolutely right. We don't necessarily want to level the whole of a city, because all you do is alienate loads of people. What you want to do is have a precise effect, precision on time. And the only way you can do that is to get intelligence. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do, to collect credible intelligence, which requires all sorts of sensors and capabilities. But if you bring that together, you end up with surgical strike. And that's been a hallmark of the West for many years.
Yeah. Don't worry, we just get these pilots that are expendable and put them in aircraft with cameras rather than guns and say, go off and have a little look at this, please, for me, and bring it back. But how much do you think this is a political statement that and will have a political effect, as well as the obvious military effect of the giving the Ukrainians a golf bag of different capabilities that they can use in different circumstances?
Yeah, I with my grey hair and yours, I tend to try to look beyond the tactics into the strategy here. Will a few extra Tomahawks make a significant difference on the battlefield? The answer is probably not. What I do think will make a difference is if Trump, or America, and particularly NATO, decides to far more robustly swing in behind Ukraine. And actually, there are lots of things that could be done. At one end of the spectrum is that we jump in fully with Ukraine to fight Russia. I'm not an advocate of that, and I'm sure you wouldn't be either. But the other end of the spectrum is that we just send them parcels of bullets and shields every now and again, and that's not working. So if we are focused on the outcome we want, I think there is a combination of sanctions. I'm not a huge believer in sanctions, but they do gradually, slowly start to have an impact. But the other one is some military options. We've talked a bit about some of those. And I think that's much more important, that rather than vacillating and swinging one way or the other, NATO needs to be much more consistent, apply consistent pressure against President Putin, stop providing him the wriggle room to get out, and therefore now force him to the negotiating table. Because quite bluntly, this war, whatever we say, will only end whenever Putin has achieved the objectives he wants, or he's forced to stop, militarily or politically. And those last two are up to us.
Well, up to us. It's important that we keep going and keep pushing out the message. And Sean, it's been a real pleasure being part of helping you to push out the message and create the understanding of what's going on. And thank you for talking to me today on Times Radio Frontline.
Always a great pleasure, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.